This is very similar to the talk that I thought I was going to give, just not quite in so much detail. Partly owing to user error on my part, a lot of the slides I wanted to show you aren't quite ready because I had issues with my computer, but I've stapled together some things that you might have seen before, and I thought we'll talk about them in a slightly different way. What we're aiming to do here is talk about the sort of underlying models that are providing the farm level information that goes into the processes that Brett talked about the other day. And so this is going to be slightly different to a lot of the talks in that we're basically going to go through, have a look at how farming is done at the moment, looking at some new insights that we're gaining from this new model that we've put together, and seeing what interesting stories we can pull out of it. And it might be quite interesting for or potentially inform some of the discussions that Ian wants to have towards the end about where do we take some of this stuff and how do we sort of generate impact with it. I know that's not quite what you're planning to talk about, Ian, but that sort of thing. Brett talked about this yesterday. Why have we built a new agriculture model? And I should make a distinction here. What I'm talking about now is a process that takes all of the data we've got about farms as they are in present day and assembles this picture of what farms look like today. And then Brett was talking about how we take that forward and try and project forward for the next 50 years. So we're just focusing on what farms look like today. It's very data driven. And we started out down this process because the way we've done things in the past was okay, but now we're moving into a realm of, so if we take a step back and think about historic agri-environment schemes, a lot of it was looking at sort of marginal land use change, putting in temporary land use change that you could reverse in a few years' time, or working at the margins of a farm. We're now talking about large areas of tree planting where you're potentially saying, we're going to radically alter how my farm works. And the way we used to look at the costs, the agricultural costs of pursuing land use change, was that we'd say, well, what is the marginal production of a field? So if I take this field, imagine it's got sheep on it, and I take away all those sheep, what is the value of those sheep? What profit do you get from those sheep? And we're going to assume that's the cost of land use change. And this is called the gross margin. It's a pound per hectare or a pound per head of thing that you're removing. And as I say, it's great for small changes. If you're on this farm here and you just take out that little red field, then that probably is going to be your cost. If I take out half the farm, suddenly the farmer's saying, well, yeah, I'm getting rid of my sheep, but I'm also getting rid of my tractor, and perhaps I'm getting rid of some of my labour. And that's a big cost saving to the farmer. And so actually the amount of money they're losing by getting rid of these sheep gets overestimated if we're using these gross margins. So we need to be able to consider net margins, which is, what are these total costs of a farm? We need to be able to rearrange a farm, basically, and then say, right, what does the economics of that farm look like now? We couldn't do that with our old approaches. The second thing is our historic modelling took sort of idealised farms that were basically 400 hectare squares in some instances. They weren't actual farms, and that made it hard to capture, picking. Is there a laser pointer? Is that a laser pointer? No, I'll use my fingers. There's a bit of variability across this farm. You probably can't see it where you are. This is an arable field here, whereas this is permanent pasture. They've got very different costs. If I take away permanent pasture and it's got sheep on it, it doesn't actually cost that much per hectare. If I take away permanent pasture and it's got dairy cows on it, that's potentially quite a large gross margin change. And if I take away an arable field, the cost is completely different again. Although we can pick up some of those differences, if we've got a farm that runs from the uplands to the lowlands, as we're going to see in a minute, the cost variation of pursuing land use change in those different places is enormous, and we weren't able to pick that out in the past, so that becomes quite important. And finally, we need spatial specificity. So farms are different all over the country because the land they're on is different. So we need to be able to pick that up, perhaps pick a different part of a farm that's next to a river or in some faraway corner. And again, that means that we need to be able to resolve these individual how the model works. So I thought I'd use it just to show you a couple of case studies. This is the agricultural land classification map that I mentioned earlier on, with the country divided between grade 1 land, which is in dark blue, grade 2 in light blue, grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, down to that sort of salmony colour. And then the red is urban areas and the orange is other things. And this was created in the 50s, this concept. The idea was that you could get to fairly coarse estimates. It does not really a predictor for individual farms necessarily. But it gives you an idea of where the good quality land is and where the poor quality land is. And you can see, in particular, around the Wash, or sort of around the Fenlands, you've got very good quality land. For reasons we're going to discuss in a minute. If you go up onto the top of Dartmoor, it's grade 5, and around there it's sort of grade 4, and that's going to be a lot of pasture land typically. And this classification system's looking at loads of things. It's looking at the climate, it's looking at the site itself. So what's the slope like? What's the flood risk like? It's looking at soil texture, and basically it's trying to work out. It's trying to give you sort of an indication of what you can grow there and how well it's going to grow. And this is quite an important measure, even though it's now, 70 years old, or almost, because a lot of our planning system relies on this. If you've got grade 1, 2, or 3, they've split grade 3 into 3A and 3B. Grade 1, 2, or 3A land, it's really hard to do stuff with it. You've got to show that you've got a really good reason that you want to change that land use, or build on it, or do something like that. Because this land is supposedly, it's called the best and most versatile land, that grouping. This is where we grow all our food, supposedly. This measure has now been sort of imported into the land use change policy areas as well, in that grade 1 and 2 land has to be saved for food production is sort of this prevailing narrative. So I've looked at how good it actually is. And you can see by the subtitle here, how do yields vary with agricultural land classification? How much better is best and versatile land really? Turns out it's not that great. So we've got yield data for about 10,000 farms across England here for four types of crops, sort of staple cereal crops. And we can now map these onto our model farms where we've built up this information on the farm itself. Do a lot of data cleaning to make sure, I won't go into it now because we don't have time, but basically we've ended up with sort of around about 1,000 farms a year that are reporting wheat yields across the country. And basically what I've done is I've plotted those yields against the farm land grade. So this is the plots that we're going to be looking at. We've got wheat yield on the left in tonnes per hectare, and the land grade across the bottom. So 1, 2, 3, 3A sits about there, 3B sits there, and 4. And best and most versatile land is in that bracket. And obviously when we plot this, because best and most versatile land is supposed to be really good, in theory the yield should be nice and high up here, and they should come down to grade 4 where wheat yield is going to be absolutely rubbish. And you plot the data and you really don't see that at all. Now you might say, well, why have you got spots in between 2 and 3? This is farms, and this is sort of the weighted average of land classification. So there's some farms that sort of sit between the two. And I've said the maps aren't that good to distinguish individual farm level grades. So if we get rid of all those things in between and try and make this a bit more readable and stick box plots on it, we end up with this. Now, the median wheat yield between grade 4 and grade 1, the difference is about a tonne per hectare, which for our best and most versatile, yes, go on.
Any knowledge of fertiliser?
Yeah, we're going to come on to that in a minute. Yeah, because that becomes quite important. You can see the big difference is in the really poor yield. So if you're going to get bad yields, it's going to be really bad on grade 4. But if we go above the median, actually it's all fairly stable. So in terms of this staple production at the moment, there's not really a big difference in the amount of food that we're producing across these different land grades. Now you could say, okay, I've aggregated 5 years here, but even if I split these out into individual years, you see a similar sort of trend. You might find that in some years grade 2 does a bit better, grade 3 does a bit better than grade 2. I think it's probably spatial variations across the country, and I've got to look at that in more detail. But this is not the trend we were expecting, certainly at the upper end of the yields in each class. What happens if we look at different crops? This is barley, a similar sort of thing, certainly up to 3B, oilseed rape, and oats. And you always think about oats, you stick that on your worst land because at least it will grow. Well, when it's being put on grade 1, we're not seeing different yields. But as you mentioned, there could be a lot of things going on. So what is going on? We'll come to fertiliser in a minute. If it's not yields that this land is best for, maybe it's the versatile bit. Maybe we're doing other things with it. So if you look at the definition of grade 1, it's got little to no limitations on agricultural use, very wide range of agriculture and horticulture crops, including top fruit, soft fruit, salads. So we'll look at this in a minute. And then grade 3B is a narrow range of crops, lower yields of a wide variety of crops. So maybe it's this versatility that makes best and most versatile land really important. So I've looked at that as well. What this is showing is this is the different areas of agricultural classes on the left. And then this is showing the proportions of different crops on each of those land grades. So this is just for arable land. Purple is temporary grass. So you can see at grade 4, we're putting a lot more temporary grass on than we are grade 1. Light blue is those staples we were just looking at, but oilseed rape is in green, so part of it comes into there. And then we get onto the slightly more specialist stuff. So the gold is potatoes and sugar beets, and the salmony colour is other crops. And if we go down to grade 1, it's about 70% of the land is being used for stuff that I'd say probably isn't a staple, because these peas are they're not the sort of peas we eat on our plate. It's going to livestock mainly. And so that's 70% of 250,000 hectares. So it's sort of what? 60,000 hectares of land, or thereabouts, 75,000 hectares of land. Even less with grade 2, although there's a lot more. But the point is, this versatile bit, if that's what we're going to focus on, is quite a small proportion of all of this land that we're classing as best and most versatile. Now, some people would say, well, okay, what if you didn't have that land? This is the stuff that people look at vertical farming for, excepting the potatoes and the sugar beet. Certainly the other crops, these horticulture and soft fruits. People pop up and say, we can do vertical farming. And we're like, yeah, but you can only grow certain things with vertical farming. Well, it's this stuff here, really. Which sort of leads us on to, if we're not getting the yields at the moment, and we're not getting there's not a massive amount of land that's being used for this really versatile, the crops that we might think of as versatile. Is it a good idea to have essentially a blanket ban on most land use change on best and most versatile land? I've gone on too early. When actually there might be a very small section of that we really want. Now, we looked at the wash earlier on. That's an area that if we want to preserve it, it's going to cost a lot in flood defences. This is sort of suggesting that as we currently use it, it's not necessarily producing certainly in terms of calories, in terms of our staples, it's not producing the stuff that might make it worthwhile putting all that money into flood defences. Now, Eva, you pointed out, you said, what about fertiliser? So there's lots of things that could be going on here. Just because this is what is being grown doesn't mean that's the potential to grow it. So what we're going to start looking at next is, can you actually get the same yield of wheat on grade 1 land for half the inputs? And that changes things slightly, because then you're saying, well, okay, maybe it is worth, in terms of your total cost, this is quite useful land. Also, what's going to happen under future climates? Maybe the wash is the only place we can grow a lot of stuff. And then it might be more cost effective to do things there. But so the main point here is that we've adopted a system that hasn't been looked at for 70 years. We haven't really updated our assumptions about what that land can do, but we're deciding some pretty big policy on the assumption that these things that held in the 60s still hold now, and it's not really the case. So I think what we're probably going to do here is we do a bit more work, look at what the costs really are, and then at least provide some evidence to say, let's just look at it again. Let's come up with a better way if we're going to try and draw lines on a map where we can't do things. So that's on the arable side. I want to sort of try to capture that here. We're going to start looking at temporary pasture. We're looking at arable systems here and temporary pasture. We also need to look at the permanent pasture on a lot of this land. Look at calorie production, look at plant change impacts and those sorts of things. Right, I've got one more case study. I'm not sure how we're doing for time.
9.
No, oh, right. Talking quick. Apologies. I thought we'd have a look at the uplands next, because we'd looked at the lowlands there. And again, some of you might have seen this before. The uplands is sort of seen as this area where we've got, again, cheap land. Obviously, it's not quite as simple as that. But this is another motivation for using this type of model rather than the ways we did things previously. So when we had survey data and we wanted to design an agri-environment scheme, we would go to the survey data and imagine we want to do some blanket bog restoration. So these are the locations of blanket bog in northern England. And we'd say, right, blanket bog, that's typically an upland farm. So we'll go to our survey data, we'll find all these farms that we've classified as upland, we'll look at their average profit per hectare, and that's the amount we're going to pay. Or if we want 50% of farmers in, we'll draw a distribution of these profits, we'll go to the 50th centile, and we'll pay that. And that was really the best we could do. And I said at the start of this presentation, what we really want from this model is spatial specificity and being able to resolve differences across a farm. And this is going to illustrate why that intra-farm variability is quite important. So there's 3 ways we could calculate these costs. We've got that farm survey approach that I've just said, where we identify all of these farms and look at their average costs. Now we've got some spatial specificity, we don't have to do that anymore. We can actually say, well, I'm going to pick an individual farm, all of the farms that overlie Blanket Bog, and just look at their profits. Does that look any different? And finally, we can look at individual field parcels as well now. So when we go through this process, we see that actually the costs we might want to compensate farmers for are quite different using these different methods. So what I've done is I've picked all of the what's called less favourable area grazing farms. This is using this survey approach. So if we're doing upland blanket bog restoration, it's going to be in less favourable areas generally. So we can pick this class of farms and look at how much it would cost to pay different farmers across this area. So what this does is we've got a cost in pounds per hectare per year on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis we've ranked farmers from the ones who have the lowest cost to the ones who have the highest cost. So the way this has been done previously, if you wanted a third of farmers to join, you come across to the 30th centile and you say, right, 30th centile, it's £30 a hectare. So we're going to offer £30 a hectare. And the theory is that then 30% of your farmers, the cheapest 30%, can join the scheme. You'll notice that this graph is zero for quite a long time. That's because a lot of upland farmers don't actually make any money. Now, with my economist hat on, that's telling me something else is going on. Maybe they're getting income from somewhere else, and maybe it's not just about setting prices, because these farmers are not maximising their profit. Well, they might be maximising their profit, but they're not making a profit. So it's not necessarily about making money, but we'll leave that to one side. This is what it looks like if you take this whole cohort of farms. But this is an enormous geographical spread. If this is the real upland areas, there's some areas around here that are actually quite low lying, which our farms, this farm category is spilling over into. So we can constrain this set of farms that we're picking to try and set our pricing and say, well, what about the farms that just overlie Blanket Bog? And these look like this, they're in the purple. So you can see that it's already a smaller subset of farms. And if we rank their costs, we find that actually it looks something like this. So if we wanted 30% of farmers, and we were using the survey method, we think we've got to compensate them £10 a hectare more than we actually have. It's not necessarily the same as what you've got to pay them to do something, but in terms of the income they're going to forego by destocking their land, this is the difference. But again, we're looking at potentially some of the cheapest bits of the farm, some of the land you can't really graze. And so we can now go again and say, well, I just want to recover the field parcels that overlie Blanket Bog, because that's where the land use change is actually going to happen. And if we do that and plot the costs of those, we find that it's this green line here, which is what? About £5 a hectare at the 30th centile. Now, you wouldn't necessarily, if you've been paying this and it got you a certain uptake, you wouldn't necessarily revert to paying that straight away. Because what we were doing here when we were paying this rate was we were compensating for the land use change and we were incentivising the farmer to do it because there was some sort of profit. So you wouldn't necessarily come in and say, right, I'm just going to pay £5 a hectare now, because the farmer's going to say, you've got to do a bit more than just compensate me for my loss. There's got to be some sort of incentive. But the point is, we didn't know that this was the actual cost or the opportunity cost of pursuing land use change on bogs, because all we have is this. So this model starts to give us this spatial specificity and variation across the farm. Now, I was going to do this with a southwest focus, but the reason I can't do that is because if we shift to the southwest, this is the South Hampshire, so Exeter's over here. This is the Blanket Bog on Dartmoor, and everything in red is common land. So when we come into the southwest, a lot of the places where we might want to do this restoration have got, I think Brent Common, I took the slide out so I couldn't share it, but Brent Common here has got something like 20 farmers grazing it. So if you want to do anything on that common, you need agreement from 20 farmers. I was hoping to show you lots of really interesting slides on this, because suddenly you're in a situation where if you want to do something on Brent Common, or you want to do anything on those 20 farms, you've got some quite complex interactions in the model. So for those of you who don't know how commons works, if you've got some sheep, you've got and you're on one of these farms that has common rights, you can send your sheep to the commons to graze every year, along with a load of other people, and then you bring your sheep back down in the winter. And you've got to have the right type of sheep to do this. So if you take sheep that have been grazed on, say, Brent Common, and you sell them at Exeter Market, and someone takes them to a common over here, they're going to walk back. It's called hefting, and it's very specific to different areas of the country. These sheep have been bred on a moor, and they will stay on their moor. But that means that you've got a lot less. You need a certain herd size to do this. It's around about 50 head of sheep. Now, if you start doing land use change on any of these farms around here that graze the common, and you drop below the point where they haven't got enough winter grazing for 50 head of sheep, they don't have enough sheep to heft anymore, so they've just got to stop grazing the commons. So all around here, there's some pretty big tipping points when we're talking about land use change, both on and off the commons. So I was hoping to be able to show you how some of these dynamics work, but my computer decided it didn't want to play. So that'll have to be in a talk, perhaps at the next Net Zero Plus meeting. But so there's some really interesting dynamics going on here. And if you think about how big Dartmoor is, they spill out to in quite a long way around the edges. And so there's a lot of these constraints that we can start on land use change that we can start to pick up with this model. So that's a bit of a teaser for next time. Oh, and I said I'd just do a quick, where are we going next? So we're going to look more at the implications of this best and most versatile land, probably in terms of flood risk. National food production rates, you've heard me say before, based on this model, the calorie production, we produce more than enough food for all of us in the country. You often say, oh, we import 40% of our food. Yes, we do by value, but not by calorific output. So we want to at least provide the facts on that so that we're not in this environment where farmers say, oh, we can't possibly do land use change. We already don't have enough food. Well, depends how you measure it. We talked about land use change and farm variability and upland economics. And finally, one I didn't talk about, land tenure is a really important issue. So about 40% of land in the UK, in England, is not owner occupied. About of that, about half is on some really old tenancies that are really hard for the landlord and tenant to practically do anything without big changes on both sides. So we need to look at what barriers that puts on pursuing land use change. It's like putting a mask over 25% of the country and say you can't really do trees here unless you're prepared to do a lot of reorganisation of farm legal structures. So we're going to do some work on that as well. Right. Thank you.